project to date. So with that, I'm going to open it up, and it looks like Mr. Johannes is ready to go. So to turn it over to Dave.
Yeah, I was thinking about this a couple of months ago, but I had operated on and disappeared for a while. One of the things I'm thinking about is mapping and what our goals are for the city of Richmond and how we manage that and how the ordinances or how our zoning ordinance is set up to basically tell our developers where we want them to build. And I think that's really important because for me, one of the goals of our city should be that we would have a car optional road city. And what that means is we would have high density pockets, but also we would have high density corridors and basically be thinking in terms of transit oriented development. But in this thought of just reaching out and how this higher density provides the opportunity for walkable neighborhoods and also for car optional neighborhoods, I think is pretty important. One of the reasons is that the car optional city would be advantageous in terms of equity and how much it costs to live in an environment. And I just looked at some statistics. They're not necessarily accurate, but they're not that far reaching. One of them was the cost of automobile ownership as well as apartment ownership and what it costs for people to live in this region. The average cost for a car is $11,500 a month, according to them. According to AAA, I noticed a couple of days ago, they sent out a report saying it was $11,200 a month. So when we're thinking about people having to have a car and live in the city and having to have an apartment or a house to live in, it's important to think about the range of expense that goes in housing. It's not just the housing itself, it's housing and transportation. And our Richmond 300 Club, Richmond 300 plan gives us a really good foundation of how that's set up and how we would have high density areas, how we would have high density commercial corridors. And it's important to me that we look at that as we focus in on developing our plan. One of my concerns about this is that if we try and put too much high density everywhere and we open up the city for high density everywhere, we're going to lose the opportunity to focus in on those areas where we could actually create more transit oriented development, support our transit and have our transit meld efficiently with our higher development. So that's sort of the focus, and as we looked at a couple of other items. So as we think about that, just to give you an idea of some of the numbers I looked at, one of the numbers outlining the housing and transportation cost in the central city or in the city of Richmond is housing and transportation costs about 39% of the income of a household. These are demographics looking at ranges of, let's say, $90,000 per household. 22% of that goes in the housing costs and 17% is the transportation. So the idea that we could reduce somebody's housing costs, living costs, by reducing the transportation, just leave the housing, would be a huge advantage for our city. As we look at our region, we don't really have that many areas that offer that opportunity of living. And some of those areas that do offer that opportunity are some of the more expensive neighborhoods in the city. The way I think that we should be doing this is we should be overlaying, of course, the Richmond 300 master plan, but we should also be taking our city bus route and using that as a primary focus for how we outline our corridors. And they correlate pretty well. The north-south route, the future BRT north-south, dropping down and cutting across Midlothian and through Belt is really, connects pretty well with our master plan, where we have a zone, high intensity zone node rather, which takes us from Midlothian over to, or from Hull Street over to Midlothian. So that would be a natural pattern. But if we take a look at just the city bus route, and the red outline shows high intensity transportation, and we take a look at the corridor plan, which is, just taken out of our books. So these are just two plans. And we put those together. We can see there's a lot of correlation between them. And I just want to make sure that we're focusing in on taking advantage of those areas which are setting up our more transit-oriented development. As we think about our development community, who's basically going to be paying for a lot of this housing, it's if we guide them to go in a direction and we stick to it, we get a little more back the years when we used to actually do our zoning development all in one place, and we keep in touch with it. It would be nice to focus more on those areas as the high density areas, along with our nodes, so that we're not spreading that development investment all over the place. If we're thinking about, to me, I'm thinking we're looking at 20 to 40, let's say 2 generations here, in which we have an opportunity to develop our systems and our transportation systems in our high density areas. And if we don't focus those efforts, we may end up spreading the pool too far. We may end up having spot areas where we're putting high intensity housing, let's say low income people who don't have access. So that's basically what I just wanted to bring to the attention of everybody. I think it's important that we tie that together pretty tightly, and we look at those areas as being more important for our high density development and our high density zoning communities. I think that's it.
No, I appreciate that. I appreciate you taking the time to put the research together and offer some comments, and the consultants are on the line and hearing what we're saying, and a lot of work went into R300, so it's right that we need following that and supporting it. I've had the benefit of talking to you about this, so I'm not going to hog conversation, but if anyone has questions or other things that they want to offer, for those of you that just joined us, thank you, Councilman Robinson. I want to recognize that you're here with us today.
Sorry, running late.
That's okay. Busy time. That we're just taking this opportunity to have an open discussion about items that are not on the agenda. Within 8 months into this process, and things maybe we have questions about or want the consultants to hear. So, anyone else want to offer anything? Or?
I would. And again, I apologize for running late from one meeting and trying to get to the other. That's the disadvantage of virtual meetings and in-person meetings. But, and I also want to apologize because I have missed several meetings. So I do feel like I've had an opportunity to have one-on-one with the staff, which has been very beneficial, and I appreciate their time. But I still feel like there's a lot of catching up that I need to do, and I will hopefully invest the time to do that. And I appreciate your comments, Mr. Jonathan, because, serving with you on the Planning Commission was one of those times where we had a lot of these discussions for quite some time. And your comments are very impactful to me. We do have a wonderful master plan. We are living in a city that high density has been segregated to certain areas of the community. And I see that same pattern continue to be followed, especially when you look at the opportunities where low-income housing and low-income tax credit housing is being located. We're still impacting those areas. And when we look at it from a regional perspective, we also see that same level of density taking place at the same location. So as we look at zoning, and we know that the other surrounding counties are also doing zoning, and are in the process, or may have, many of them are farther ahead maybe than we are. Having an opportunity to stop and look at what's going on regionally and how it impacts our boundaries, I think would be extremely important as well, because when we talk about transportation, now that we have a regional transportation board, and looking at more regional transit, where that connects, and how it connects, and looking at their master planning and their zoning as to where they're perhaps looking at high density as well, just to make sure that we are not repeating history over and over again without taking the necessary steps to make a difference. The other thing that I'm concerned about is that you're right. What we're talking about with accessibility to transit is a big, big, big ticket item. And except for Richmond, historically, we have not had any of that in the region. And when we talk about zoning and its relationship to transit, if we are not giving a level of priority to where we have already intentionally concentrated density, to make sure that we are respecting those areas that have been neglected with infrastructure, but instead focusing on new potential growth only, or more importantly, I think that equity lens that we talk about all the time needs to be overlaid so that we make sure that as we look at future planning, that we are planning with an inclusive zoning in place to make that happen. And the other thing that is frequently not incorporated in our master planning and any other planning that we do is a budget that goes along with that planning process. And it's great to talk about major transportation arteries and those kinds of things in the absence of budget, or zoning, or special ordinances that allow us to not mandate parking with the intent of using more transit, but budget for transit is not in place, and we create an adverse impact in the process. I think those are some of the concerns that we need to be careful that we intentionally address as we look at this rezoning strategy.
I guess for the record, I'll just co-sign on pretty much everything Mr. Johannes said.
Yeah, I'll kind of jump on there. I think that much of what David said was referencing back to the Richmond 300 future land use map and the transit-oriented nature of how that envisions absorbing much of the projected 35,000 housing units that we're going to need. But I hope that we don't get to the point where we think that that's where all of it's going to go, and that we, I agree that we should be using this opportunity to create denser transit-oriented developments in a variety of places throughout town. But I don't want us to leave existing low-density neighborhoods, to give them a free pass, so to speak, to remain in that nature, and to not expect that any of the burden or opportunity, however you want to look at it, of absorbing new development will, we don't want that to be completely segregated away from the existing lower density areas. So that's where our opportunities for duplexes. So, when I look at how we're looking at now removing duplexes from these draft RB and RC, I don't know what that means exactly, but it sounds like moving away from the idea of having more units in our lower density areas. And that's a potential concern.
I want to hop in on that too, because I was looking at the same thing and I was also concerned about that. Maybe some of this took shape in the meeting that I was having some tech issues, but like, I'm not sure how we got to settling that like duplexes by right were just like off the table or not an option. So I would be interested in hearing more about how we did land on removal of duplexes from RB and RC to Damien's point. And then something I guess for future agenda items that I'm also concerned about is just figuring out what ways zoning, I know zoning is limited, but we need to have an eye towards like anti-displacement measures and to whatever extent zoning can achieve some type of anti-displacement, whatever. Yeah, we need to have an attention to that because even as the more we're adding density and even as we're considering, really densifying development in zones, areas that are already dense, people are gonna get displaced and surrounding counties will not have the infrastructure, surrounding counties won't have the transportation to accommodate people's needs. I don't want to see people who are my neighbors getting pushed out of Richmond any more than they already are. So that's just something else.
I have a question. Billy, are we gonna be able to talk about the duplexes citywide later in today's meeting? If not, I'd like to talk about it now.
I was gonna ask Mary Ann that because I suspect that some of that came from the last meeting where we
Right.
broke into groups and talking about duplexes and single family areas was one of the questions that we were discussing as a group, and we haven't really reported out on that yet. So I think that's gonna be today. Okay. Did you want to offer a comment?
I'm gonna talk
Mr.
about it
Director?
when we
Okay.
talk about the districts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Great.
I just have one comment. Sorry I joined late. I was on another city meeting right before this. I agree with Mr. Johannes when you're talking about GRTC overlaying with the routes. That's like exactly what we did in Richmond 300. We were like, how do we enhance these and how do we support future land uses that kind of encourages as much transit as possible. I agree with you as well, Damien, Dr. Pitt, that we don't, we want to encourage a certain level of redevelopment in the rest of the city as well, not just like it's only in these areas. So we'll have to figure out how we balance that in the zoning ordinance, making sure to Councilman Robertson's point that we're looking at it kind of equitably across the city and like how do we make sure that we're not reconcentrating poverty in areas that have been those areas for a long time. So we need to hold all those things in balance as we move forward.
I think this is very good conversation, and it's why I asked that we have this agenda item, because oftentimes we have such a lengthy agenda, we don't get to just have open discussion and give the consultants an opportunity to hear some of the things that are on our minds outside of the agenda and things that come up after the meeting. So we still have some time before we move to the next discussion item. Make sure that everybody gets the opportunity to chime in if they want to, and if not, we can make sure that we have this type of open discussion going forward. It may mean at some point we have to maybe lengthen our meetings a little bit because there's a lot to cover here. And we're already 8 months in, and I know it seems like not a long time, but we got to get the zoning moving. So, Wayne, did you have anything, or you just
Absolutely.
disagree?
Yes. So, I know last meeting hello everybody. Last meeting, what's been a concern for me that I've been speaking out about is the industrial use definition. And so I think even as we navigate what goes where, really understanding and really having a sense of when we put certain labels or categories on different places, what does it really mean? And making sure that in trying to help the city on paper, that we're not hurting the city when it comes to how it will actually be pieced together. The other thing that I'm concerned about, I know the last time we were kind of really pressed for time. And I'm not comfortable with having to answer a certain amount of questions under a certain time limit for the city. That's not going to work. And so I think what will be responsible is if we really look at, I don't know if the time needs to be increased. I know we have things to do, but this is important. or shifted in the agenda, or even if the questions themselves need to be reimagined in a way that would give us a better, more flexible time to be able to really sift through the questions from Richmond.
That's good feedback. And I know that later in the agenda, we're going to discuss working groups, and maybe that will be the opportunity going forward where we can get working groups formed around certain topics. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, not knowing exactly the direction staff's thinking with that, but that would be an opportunity to break into smaller groups, have more detailed conversations and kind of report back so that, because we are pressed for time, and my comment about 8 months is, it doesn't seem like that long, but it is, and we want to stay on track. So we will probably have to, looking at Mary Ann, keep in mind maybe adjusting some schedules or how we structure these work groups so that we have the opportunity to have the conversation that needs to be had on the topic, on the zoning ordinance. So.
One other topic,
Sure.
which I really have thought about in the past, but not recently. In the, I think it's the BRT plan, we have some limited controls or design suggestions. I'm wondering, as we develop the ordinance, are we going to be able to do something to have some quality control over what's being built? So an example would be, we have a 175-foot apartment building that's allowed in one of the districts, and it's just a row of windows all the way with no variation. I don't know if that gets controlled during the POD process.
Were you here when they talked about, there's one thing that's like the building, blah, blah, blah. I'm very good.
Sounds good.
I'm very technical.
Yeah.
Building with max, which for the way that I understood Code Studio described was that like here it can be 200 feet wide is the max, but there's rules that will be brought in that's not shown here about like, creating variation through various elements that
Right,
get
no, I
introduced
didn't
to
catch
break
that.
up the facade. So that was
That's one of
something,
my big issues.
yeah. So that was something that they talked about. But
I
yeah,
think
Feels to
Mary
me
Ann.
in like the modules, I think what we're gonna get into, and Renee can tell me if I'm wrong, the development standards are gonna come in more detail. later.
Yeah, I'll speak to that a little bit when I talk about the plan for the next year. So
I just want to caution on discussions on development standards. I agree, we don't want buildings to all look the same. We want high quality. But I think there's a difference to aesthetics and how they appear and whether or not we should start getting into what type of product is used, because that can very easily turn into driving cost. So I just want to keep that in mind as we're talking about development standards, that we want good quality development that's going to sustain and make our communities look as good as they do now. But I get a little nervous when we start picking and choosing what materials we're going to use. So, my 2 cents in. Great. A couple more minutes before we hit the Roger.
Yeah, say something about this before I forget about it. Something I think along these lines might be worth considering as part of the supplemental regulations. When council did away with the parking requirements, they did it, shall we say, in a rather simplistic way without really doing anything else in the ordinance. And that's not the way it was done in a lot of other cities. The one that was often used was Buffalo. And in fact, at the same time they did that, they also created something called transportation demand management. And almost anything other than low density residential has to go through a process where the developer has to show how not having that parking is okay because of all of the other things they've done to eliminate the need for it. And there's a long list of these things. And the bottom line is the project must meet the anticipated transportation demand without placing an unreasonable burden on public infrastructure, such as transit and on-street parking facilities and the surrounding neighborhood. So what they gave away with one hand, they pulled it back with another by creating a long list of things that the developer has to do to say, we're just not going to ignore it. We're going to do something to make sure that the need is actually met. So,
How do they,
How are the two working too well together, in your opinion?
I've been meaning to call them, talk to
Who is
them about
them?
Buffalo.
Oh.
How do they keep that from becoming arbitrary? Conversation?
That's anytime you have a approval process, you have the potential for that. And that's a very good point.
Telephone demand, without placing any more demand on transit. And like, in some places, like you might want more demand on transit, because then it proves that your system
Right.
needs more federal funding. So like, that's one where I'd be like,
Well, I think the idea was that they wanted to encourage development in locations where it was more available.
Interesting thought.
It'd be interesting to get some follow-up information on that, because even for what Richmond has in place, how effective the two are balancing out the benefit of one without, and are we meeting the demand, the transportation demand, and is it making it a just system that works for everyone, accomplish the mission at hand?
Thank you for sharing. Great. There's
One other simple question I had, and we may have already done this, and I just need to look back. We had talked about from the very beginning that one of the things that we wanted to accomplish is the reduction in the number of SUPs that we get. And so I guess if there's something that has already been done that looked at the SUPs and, are they majority setback kinds of things versus other more need for complete rezoning, to make sure that as we look at what we are doing, we are fulfilling those kinds of demands that causes us to have such a high level of SUPs in the city.
Yeah, staff, or excuse me, the consultants with staff have been looking at that. I don't want to say or answer for staff if they've gone through one SUP, one after the other, but part of the analysis is looking at our existing zoning. Does it match on the ground? And if not, jump in here that wants to save me. And what what are the different setbacks and stepbacks and lot widths and dimensions, and kind of what we need to be thinking of going.
Take a look at
The pattern book.
pattern book that was just put online, and I can. We're looking at it at a city scale, and a block scale, and a building scale. So really that city scale, the that, and also a selecting.
So to answer your question is yes, there's been some analysis and that you have to speed on some of the pattern book details. Nothing has been adopted. It's all just been analyzed by the consultants and presented forward. So we're not at that stage yet.
Oh, I think more specifically what I'm asking, I know that we've looked at some of those and I've experienced, been fortunate to observe that we are looking at those kinds of regulatory requirements. What I guess what I'm asking though is that with the volume of SUPs that we've previously done, is 90% of them setbacks, or is 50% of them really need for rezoning? I guess that's what I'm trying to make sure that we have a good analysis of those SUPs.
No, it's a great question. I'm going to defer to
And-
Director Vaughn
And if
on
we
that.
have, that's fine. I just need to go back and look at it for my
Sure.
own.
So I think part of the discussion as we get into the different districts is we go back, right? One of the purposes of the rewrite is to capture and legalize what we have today existing. And so, we can go, I'll say, all the way to one end of the scale and say, no zoning requirements whatsoever, right? Lot size, height, whatever, everything is now conforming, right? But I think what we're trying to do is find the right way to capture as much as possible, right? And this is a balance here in terms of I think the pattern book shows, right? A lot of these nonconformities come from lot size and lot width. So where could we maybe move the scale to get the lot size and the lot width correct? That instead of having, right, 60% non-conforming, we have 60% conforming, or maybe 80% conforming. I think it's gonna be really tough to get 100%. I don't want to kid us like we're gonna get 100% everywhere, but where can we get that right balance of getting much more conforming with also understanding that think some of the things that have been brought up here, well, what does that mean for those that may be like way over conforming? And I say that in the way of like that have maybe like really big lots
Mhm.
or really wide spaces in terms of like, okay, how could they now be developed in the future?
Right.
And so to have, I think as we'll talk about, trying to get a balance of allowing somebody to, right, one, develop their property by right, but also not to slide it so far that now it becomes seen as a development opportunity for an external resource to come in and be like, all right, I'm going to develop this and make 8 units out of it. And so I think that these are part of the conversations that we're having, but I think for the policy decision is like, all right, how far do we want to move that line in terms of like to get as much conforming, I think, as possible. I think more than we have today, but like how far back do we go? I think that's part of that discussion that we're going to be having today. And as part of set the rules for each of the districts.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, I want to keep us on the agenda time. So this was a great discussion, and I'll talk with staff about how we can leave this time into future agendas, make sure that we're just getting some time to chat as a group. But with that, I'm going to move us over to the consultant presentation. I think we're starting with summary of engagement with LaToya Thomas.
Yeah, just give me a second. I'm going to share the presentation for LaToya.
I'm gonna make sure you can hear me.
I can hear you.
If I stand here, is this okay? Mike, right there? Okay. If I stand here, you're okay? I just don't want to block the view. I know some people, if I stand there, my hair can be in the way.
If I can see you,
You
then
can
I
hear
can
me?
hear you.
Sure. I'm gonna hang out here. If folks need to move, I'm happy to. There's another monitor here that they'll be able to turn.
Just confirming, can you see my screen right now? Can you see the presentation?
Yep.
Great.
Okay, so again, I'm LaToya Thomas, principal of CoRe. We are the engagement consultant that is working with Code Studio in the city, supporting stakeholder engagement across the entire code refresh process. As you all know, we are, the other monitors up for folks, depending on which direction you want to look. We are working through 5 phases for code refresh. Believe it or not, 2024 was phases 1 to 4. It was really everything to get up to phase 5, which is the actual drafting of the zoning ordinance itself. So what I'm talking about today is a very quick overview, key highlights from phases 1 to 4 of engagement. These are highlights. I'm going to go through them quickly with the caveat that there is a larger summary report that we have written that will be shared as well. So a much longer document to support these highlights. So I just want to go over some of the key things that we did, but mostly what we heard. So you can also hear what various stakeholders across the city have been saying, and then talk about some shifts that we're also making in our approach as we move into 2025. So just some quick highlights of some of the activities that happened as part of the first set of phases of engagement. The city launched the project website. We hosted the kickoff webinars to actually introduce people to what the whole zoning update is about and how it ties back to R300 and the implementation of the comprehensive plan. We hosted open houses. We had the zoning panel discussion. That was a bit of a history of zoning, zoning 101, and particularly zoning in the city of Richmond. We've started hosting in the fall stakeholder roundtables. I'll talk a little bit more about that because that was a very important shift that we made in the fall, specifically thinking about how we target certain stakeholder groups in the city and how we're going to be using that going forward. We did pop-ups. If you're not familiar with what a pop-up is, we have some pictures up there, but pop-ups were basically bite-sized engagement opportunities where we took a lot of the content on different display and interactive question boards to folks in the communities and quite a bit of time doing these pop-ups, particularly on the south side, trying to get to renter households, to Latino, Spanish-speaking households, American households, to low-income residents. And so that was a big tool that we used, particularly in the summer and winter months. There were stakeholder interviews, different meetings with other community organizations, and obviously the ZAC meetings that have been happening today. To date, we've engaged about 400 stakeholders. And I would say that number is probably a little short because there have also been a number of other conversations in the city
in partnership with CoSIDO has had with several neighborhood associations, particularly with the drafting of the pattern book content itself. Next slide. Again, this gives you a quick overview of those activities that I highlighted and where we saw turnouts of people. Again, kind of a mix. The roundtables, we started off by calling the roundtables and they're calling the roundtables in town. Tonight, I'm actually here because tomorrow evening we have a roundtable turned into a town hall meeting in the district that Councilmember Jones and her team have coordinated. So that could be substantially more than a typical roundtable turnout. But in general, we're able to talk to both small groups of people, but also larger groups of people in different settings. And that's really the goal of having a number of different ways to engage in different spaces to get different kinds of people in the conversation. Next slide. So I'm going to walk through some of the key takeaways. Some of this echoes, I think, things that you've been saying tonight or things that you've said in other meetings as a committee. I think some of this information may not be surprising, some of it might be. And these are, again, summary key takeaways from across the board that we've heard in the different engagements and different stakeholder groups. The summary report that we're releasing will actually parse out where some of this feedback is coming from in terms of certain demographic groups, certain stakeholder groups, and certain spaces that we've done for engagement. You can see where they may be differences depending on where people are located or whether. First theme was around the future of zoning. There was a lot of emphasis to ensure or interest in ensuring that future zoning implementation also ties to implementation of housing policies, transportation policies, economic development policies, climate policies. So making sure that we're not just rewriting the zoning code for the sake of writing a code, but that all of the other related policies that exist can respond to that zoning ordinance. There was a lot of interest expressed in accessory dwelling units or ADUs, tiny homes, options for expanding housing opportunity for folks who already own their homes and may have a way to build them. Also support for mixed-use neighborhood development near transit, particularly in South Side. I know that came up earlier, so again, we've heard those conversations, particularly with South Side residents, around seeing development happen, but not necessarily seeing the transit options to make that development or accessing other things from that development piece. Another theme was around neighborhood uses and compatibility. Zoning should support economic diversification, so there was definitely interest in seeing reduction in nuisance businesses, things like liquor stores, particularly if there are concentrations of those businesses in one neighborhood, and reduced car reliance. Again, another theme that was brought up this evening. There were also concerns about businesses that are opening that only cater to 9 to 5 workers in some neighborhoods, which means those neighborhoods are going quiet in the evenings. And so residents who might live there don't necessarily have services they can access. Next slide. Aging in place. So definitely a lot of interest in having ways for homeowners to expand on existing lots so that they can actually stay in their homes. Creating zoning to allow for more senior apartments and other housing forms that might support aging in place as well. Mixed generation housing was raised, so thinking about housing that can accommodate whether it's adult child, young children, grandparents, or grandparents who might be raising grandchildren, or some other mix. And how can zoning address affordability and barriers through rent-to-own programs? Potential positive impacts on zoning. A lot of people stated, rental housing, especially with quality rental housing that's affordable, is limited. And so acknowledging that zoning is a way to increase and diversify the supply that's actually on the market. Also stated earlier this evening, zoning should reduce the need for SPUs, special use permits, and really try to streamline the development process, particularly for new housing. There was a lot of concern expressed about concentration of a single housing type in one neighborhood. And so again, interest in seeing more diversification in housing options that are available. And also a lot of questions around how zoning can address affordability, particularly in light of state imposed restrictions and limitations like the building. Next slide. A couple of these slides talk about reflections that we have, again, as we went through the engagement process, and we also maybe shifted either content we were using or even some of our Unsurprisingly, a lot of stakeholders that we spoke with were unfamiliar with zoning. Zoning is not necessarily something that is talked about in your day-to-day unless you have the fortune or misfortune to work in this industry. And so, again, it's just the basic reality that we've got to educate folks in very easy terms around what zoning is, what it does, what it doesn't do, but also how it relates to a lot of the other things that people talk about in their day, whether that's housing or economic development. We also did find that we had to do, and we found this out actually after our first set of pop-ups, we had to provide some education on Richmond 300. So we started doing some pop-ups, and we really only had content to introduce code refresh when we started. And we started asking people, well, this ties to Richmond 300. We got a lot of question marks. So we ended up having another pop-up board made that specifically gave a 101 on Richmond 300. So we could easily tell the story around, this is the comprehensive plan, these are the elements of it, this is what the plan says, and then this is where the zoning update falls into play with that. So again, trying to tie or connect the ties for people as they're going through this process. One lesson from the last 4 phases of engagement, and we actually started implementing a new tool in the last probably 2 or 3 months, really trying to explain to folks what zoning doesn't do. I think a lot of you, particularly folks, those of you who are in the room who might be really involved in your communities and talking to folks about this process, you probably know there are challenges when folks might have very real and important questions, such as, okay, there's a housing development coming up here. When's a bus stop and get added right here? Zoning doesn't do anything about the bus stop, but there are policies that can influence the creation of a bus stop and the expansion of bus lines in that area. And so we started developing content, specifically a presentation slide that we've been testing out, that basically creates a comparison between zoning policy and what zoning does, and what we're calling direct investments. So what are the things that result from that? For example, in Southside, one thing that we've heard a lot is lack of green space. We want more green space. We want more spaces where we can recreate, where our kids can play safely, and we really want to have green spaces that support climate, sustainability, healthy living. Zoning itself, as a tool, does not necessarily plant the trees and plant the grass that goes into those green spaces. Zoning can put some parameters in around green space, but then there are other policy investments, the direct investments that then create that green infrastructure. So really trying to, again, parse out for folks just so there's clarity around what zoning is, but then how the other policies come in. Next slide. So unsurprisingly, the larger public events, the open houses, panel discussions, bigger scale events, those are typically drawing stakeholders that are already plugged into city processes. That's not a surprise. And so that's why we really started to leverage things like pop-ups, and in the fall, introducing a roundtable model. For 2025, we're going to continue to use those alternate tools. So there are still panel discussions planned for this year. There are still open houses that will be developed and executed in coordination with the module releases. But we are still also going to be doing pop-ups. We are mostly expanding our roundtable model. So again, as I mentioned, I'm here tonight because I have to be here tomorrow night for the 9 district roundtable turned town hall. But we're going to be having quite a few roundtables and town halls over the course of the next year in very specific targeted areas and with very specific interest groups and demographic groups. And the goal here is to make sure that we are bringing those voices into the conversation, especially if they're not going to come to some of those bigger citywide events. We are still trying to also leverage existing community networks. We've obviously made relationships with a number of organizations and people in the city, continuing to work through that and build those connections to share information and also get encourage more people to come into the process and into the conversation. We're also continuing to develop materials both in English and Spanish. A lot of our outreach, particularly during the summer, particularly at the Southside Community Services Center and some of the libraries that we went to, we had to have materials and staff who were bilingual. And we did, thankfully. But that's, again, a continued need, particularly as we think about meeting the needs of different demographics in the city. Next slide. So, I mentioned kind of our need to talk about zoning versus direct investment. So one thing that we've been talking about is particularly as we think about what the open house series looks like for the next couple of months, is where possible, bringing in some of those other city agencies who have perhaps plans that are already drafted or in process that might speak to some of these policy initiatives that are of concern. Transportation policies, climate policies, recreation, green space policies. Bringing them into the conversation to actually try to make a relationship around what the initiatives are they're working on and how that ultimately can relate to zoning decisions that are made. We're trying to, again, create this more holistic ecosystem to make zoning less amorphous and less obscure for folks that aren't dealing with this every day. And also so people can try to see where the implementation of zoning and things that are of concern to them about zoning come into play through other avenues of the city. Next slide. So as I mentioned, some of our key engagement tools, we will have another round of panel discussions. We have 2 more panel discussions slated for this year. 3 open houses. 3 open houses per module. We have 3 modules, really modules 1A, 1B, and then 2 are going to be kind of the bulk of the zoning content. And that's what the open houses will support. Our activations, we have up to 18, and that number is a little fluffy, probably going to be more than that. But that's a mix of things. That's the roundtables, town halls, that's pop-ups, that's neighborhood association engagement, that's other kind of convenings with existing groups. We are also, again, trying to work through different networks. One thing we are going to be doing in 2025 is reactivating the prior Richmond 300 ambassadors, particularly around their own existing networks. We met with them late last year to talk about some of the models and how they've worked and some things we're trying to do for 2025. So we're setting up a particular pathway for those ambassadors to get engaged with the networks that they're currently working at. And again, as we started the project, we are still prioritizing target populations like African American households, Latino households, youth, and residents in the 8 to 9. I think that's my last slide.
Yeah, that's right. I can speak to the next section here, which is about the 2025 to 2026 timeline. And then I'm happy to.
Can you pause for just a second?
Sure.
Did anyone have any questions for Latoya before she steps away?
I'm not going anywhere.
Right. Were you set from the podium? Okay.
I have one
Yeah.
actually. Yes. Thank you so much for this. I'm looking at the stakeholder focus roundtables, and it shows that it was about 15 people that attended.
Yes.
Was there a particular, I know that it was new, right? Was there a particular reason why only that many people came out?
Sure. So we had 2 roundtables. We actually kind of have 3. The one that's actually tomorrow was supposed to happen.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a few weeks and some rescheduling for, which is how we have in January on that one. The 2 that we hosted, the first one was renters. That was actually the larger of the 2. So that one we had, of the 15, 12 to 13 of that number actually that there were people. Latino roundtable was not as well attended as we would have liked. We actually worked with a couple of community organizations to try to promote that. We had more registrants than we actually had attendees. Unfortunately, that sometimes happened with meetings, which is again why we're doing these frameworks in different settings at different points in time, like we over the course of the next year. But the renter roundtable of the 2 was the most well attended with about 12 or 13 individuals. For something like a roundtable, particularly if we're doing it online, kind of like focus group style, that 10 to 15, 10 to 20 max number is kind of a sweet spot because it allows us to have a solid 60 to 90 minute conversation with a group. And it's not just us presenting, it really is us actually asking questions. All of the questions that we also set up, we had some general questions that spanned all the roundtables, but we also had some specifically tailored to that particular interest group event. It would allow for a lot more robust conversation we had. After tomorrow night, I'm actually excited to kind of tell you how tomorrow night goes, because when we were planning for a roundtable, it's been promoted as a town hall. So I am going in tomorrow night prepared to either facilitate for 20 people or to facilitate for 90 people. I'm actually not sure. So, but again, it'll be kind of the same approach. We're going in with some kind of general questions that we want to ask of people, but also some very specific.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Latoya. So yeah, I'm just going to go over the 2025, 2026.
Sorry, Renee.
Sorry, I can't see when people raise their hands. Apologize.
It's okay. Sorry about that, Renee.
It's Yanina. Just a quick question in regards
rest of the roundtable tomorrow. When and where is that happening?
It is at Pop's Bingo Hall on Giant Street Road.
Right.
Drive, thank you, Drive. 6 o'clock. 6 to 8.
Oh, last question, I'm sorry. Is this being marketed on social media too? Is it, how is the
Yeah, so
marketing?
that particular meeting, since we as a team, like the consultant team didn't organize that, the council member's office is actually organizing that one, so we're invited into their kind of standing town hall meeting.
The standing town hall will be pretty.
Right, so, that's it, I'm not sure how for staff, but we received a flyer for it, we have been going with them, just trying to get a date set. I'm not sure how they are actually promoting it, but it's not something that we're convening. So like we made a decision just because it's not necessarily our meeting, we're not necessarily advertising it through the traditional channels that we might use for other refresh kind of sponsored meetings, if that makes sense.
Gotcha.
All right, Renee, thanks
Right.
for your patience.
Sorry, no worries. It's just I see like a tiny picture of the room, so it's hard for me to tell who's raising their hand. So yeah, I just want to give you a bit of an overview of 2025, 2026. At the very beginning of this process with you, we gave you a timeline for the project, but it was mostly focused on 2024. So I want to kind of just give you sort of a lay of the land as to where we're going next after this. So this, you already saw this timeline at the very beginning. This is kind of the overall project timeline. A few of the dates have changed a little bit. We've fallen a little bit behind where we were planning to be at the beginning. But phase one was really just the kickoff with staff before we met you guys. Phases 2, 3, and 4 were most of what we worked through in 2024 and up to the present. So the pattern book, the zoning ordinance framework, and the zoning districts framework. And we're now close to transitioning into phase 5, which is the rest of the project, which will be the draft and the final zoning ordinance. And so that's going to be broken down in a number of ways, which I'll show you now. Just to kind of give you the next 2 months quickly. January 15th ZAC meeting, that's today, of course. The draft pattern book is now available, as Marianne said before, for you to review and comment on. There's some ongoing meetings that are going to be happening with neighborhood associations on the pattern book over the next month. And the consultant team is beginning just now to work with city staff on doing some mapping tests, which we'll be sharing with you guys in March. In February, there's not going to be any ZAC meeting, but instead we're encouraging all you guys to come and attend the panel event with the housing focus on February 11th, and at least one of the 3 open houses that we're planning, one in the north, one in the south, and a pop-up at City Hall. Looking beyond that to the rest of the year, we're kind of, because the zoning code is such a huge project, we're kind of going to be delivering it into 3 different pieces that we call modules. And so those are going to be delivered over the course of 2025. And there'll be lots of opportunities at each one of these steps to kind of to see what we're doing and to comment and for revisions. So none of these things are going to be the final. These are all drafts that are going to be put in front of you guys, and we can have a discussion about each one of them as they come out. And then they'll be put together into a complete draft at the end of that process. So module 1, which is probably the one that people are most interested in. This is kind of most people think of when they think of zoning. That's the actual districts, which we've been going over as a draft or as a preliminary draft with you so far. We'll be presenting a detailed version of the districts, including the use tables and the mapping as module 1. Module 2 will be the development standards that gets into things like landscaping and transitions, signs, vehicle access, and other types of standards that get applied across the city. And then module 3 will be the administration and like provisions. So how we review applications and how we allow for amendments and relief. So all those sort of things, again, trying to think about streamlining that process, making it more logical, making it easier, making it make more sense. We'll be addressing that at that point. So those are the 3 components that we'll be delivering it in. The timeline is going to be like this. So module 1, going to be initially presented to you guys in draft in March of this year. So just 2 months from now. And we'll have 2 more months of ZAC meetings to have follow-up discussion on it. So April and May, we'll be able to hear all of your comments on it, go through different details of it, think about things that we might want to change, and so on. There's also going to be a public meeting at the end of that process where we present the draft districts, uses, and maps, which will be happening in June. So there'll be both an open house and a panel event at that point. Module 2, the development standards, going to be presented to you guys in June in draft. And then there'll be 2 more months for discussion after that. And then there'll be Module 3 after that, presented in discussion. This will be a lot shorter than the others because we'll be talking mostly about administrative processes rather than a huge amount of graphics and other content. So I think we can do that a bit faster. That's going to be 1 month for both presentation and discussion. At the end of that process, we're going to put together an open house again and another panel event that's associated with the completed draft, but that'll be in October of this year. So we'll present the whole draft to you in October. So it'll be all 3 of those modules revised with whatever changes we want to make, put together into one document. And then we'll have 2 more months, November and December, to discuss that. There's also going to be an open house and panel event in October. So those will be shared with the public at that point. And then after whatever revisions that get made at that point, we'll be presenting the final product ready for a formal public hearing and adoption process in, let's say, the winter or spring of 2026. There isn't a specific date set for that yet. So at this point, any questions about the timeline?
Yes, Roger.
Yeah, this is the first time I've seen this, but is it actually being proposed that the citywide remapping will actually be part of this process and be considered the final approval at the same time as the zoning ordinance?
I could put that to staff if you want confirmation, but that's certainly my understanding is that we were going to be doing the mapping.
They'll all be done together.
Yes.
So I imagine that's probably the most complicated part to present to you and to review. So I'm hoping we can have lots of discussions over a several month period to look through the detailed elements of the mapping. Of course, we're not starting from scratch. We have Richmond 300 as the guide, and we're going to be doing everything in alignment with that. But obviously, there will be nuances and gradations well beyond what was in Richmond 300.
Any additional questions for Renee? Starting the timeline. Okay, well, we'll move to the next agenda item, which is going to be a discussion of working groups. And for this, we'll have Maria and Chris.
Working group. Thank you all who had the opportunity to do survey on the working group. Again, as you see on the screen right before us, the working groups, the thought of these working groups are to be reviewing the content as the modules are rolled out. Different than the Richmond 300 working groups where we're creating, they're creating content. These are more bodies to review the content through these different lenses that we suggested some and it's some great suggestions. For those who completed the survey, there was interest in all the ones that were shared. So housing affordability, several members of the advisory council, sustainability, resiliency, and places of worship is a slightly different one. It was one of these topics that almost we kind of see more as a focus group as the use is changing, it's evolving, how places of worship are used. We wanted some expert thoughts on those. It might that one might be one that will only cover one of the modules, having a conversation about how places of worship define those uses are permitted. Small business and entrepreneurship support, we had interest in that as well. Community safety, this was one suggested by the consultant team, that as well. And so the next set of ideas are ideas that came from the council. Several members were interested in a working group regarding technical review of the zoning text. One specified a lot of the details of what that technical review could include and some of the legal aspects of it. So a lot of our land use attorneys and zoning professionals suggested a working group revolving. They're using the transportation lens as another one, placemaking, one that wasn't suggested by members, but one that internally I meant to put on the list to send out to you all as historic preservation. So those were the topics that currently we had interest in establishing these working.
I have a question about the technical review of zoning text, like, I feel like if we're all trying to look at the text that's presented through one of these lenses, or like, we're all, I don't know. It feels like there's a lot of overlap there, like, but then this other group is just gonna look at the text. I feel like that's maybe a later module, like, phase.
Yeah, does this working group, building off that, I guess for clarification, would this working group be chewing on like the uses and the mapping as much as they might be chewing on the administrative module that comes later? Like when and how do these working
I
groups?
think we're still kind of exploring how they make sense. Like the thought would be like every module that each working group would take the opportunity to look at that module through this lens. But and maybe some of them, it doesn't make sense that the transportation working group looks at the administration special approval process. I think those should be a separate.
Right, because admittedly, I was one of the technical people, but if that can be saved until later in the process when it makes more sense to have that, like I'd gladly join the portability one as we discuss module 1. Right, so.
I think maybe to that point, and I'm just out of cameras. I think, going through some of these working groups, I think are a little bit more policy discussions, and the technical piece might come at the end. I think also for people who, right, work in this field and cases, I'm like, let me run this through and see what happens.
Right.
Is that what is intended to do? And I think, troubleshooting it that way, I think kind of comes at the end. Some of these might be like, hey, we also have these other things, right? That council has put out there, these other documents aside from Richmond 300, are we capturing some of those as well? And so I think it's part of the policy piece. That technical, will probably come later.
Yeah.
In the process.
That's helpful clarification. I couldn't tell when we were going to be doing what respective to working groups.
Additional questions for Mary?
Did historic district regulations disappear from the zoning ordinance? The last time I looked, they weren't there.
They haven't. Maybe a Muni code issue, but I can assure you, we have not.
I thought maybe they were pulled out for somewhere else. The Mooney code, they're not in there. That's not.
We figured it out, but they're still there.
It's not very good for the public if they're looking for them. So anyway, the historic district regulations, are they being looked at as part of this process?
They're still, they're under the overlay districts. They're in Article 9, Division 4.
Yeah, I looked there and I just see. They're also not in my printed copy of the ordinance that I got not long ago. Anyway,
No,
the bottom line is we're not going to deal with those.
Separate coming.
So both the design review districts and the historic districts are not being looked at right now.
Yes. Are we, so just, my takeaway on this is that, even without the technical review, if we're pushing that back later in the process, that's still 8 potential topics, which seems to be way too many working groups to me, and a couple ideas, I think that for the purpose of what we're doing here, sustainability, transportation could be kind of part of that. If I'm looking at a zoning code through the lens of sustainability, I think the main thing I'm looking at is, what does it mean for transportation, right? Placemaking and historic preservation would be another one that could be kind of blended.
I'm not quite understanding how this is handled and managed. Are we going to be breaking into groups with other people? And
The thought of the working groups, the members of the advisory council, staff who have special skills in topic areas, and members of the public that also have background in these would form almost a working group to discuss. So it's not just a subcommittee of the advisory council, but also opening up to the public that how it was written in bylaws.
this would fit where in the schedule?
We are figuring that out.
Okay, so like-
That's why.
We're saying, but throughout the schedule, right, looking at.
Right, and so. I'm not going to talk about that this morning, kind of, this was just together today, so this can be modified, but kind of this week confirming the council interest and willingness to lead and interest in these groups. This week, getting that kind of feedback, as working with those council members that want to be a part of that group to figure out a schedule and when it makes sense to fit into the process with staff this month and into February, and then putting it out to the public for their participation in February, thinking that the working group meetings could start in March after that first module is rolled out to the advisory, to the council as a whole.
So you're gonna reach out to us and see how many of us are interested in certain
Right,
topics.
so we will revise survey and bring it back and get that feedback. But
So if any of you have, right, a
Yeah.
really strong interest, like I want to lead this particular group, and expressing that in our follow-up, because then we will do two things. One, we'll get city staff to augment and help facilitate that group, and then work on figuring out, all right, how then we, establish a way to do meetings and then open that up to the public for others who want to participate in that. But I think the most important step is like, we just don't need to create groups for group's sakes just because they're good ideas. I think we want some leadership from this room to say like, yeah, I really want to dive into it. Because again, in terms of some of the time constraints we have here, these are going to be sessions that we set up separately to really like dive in and focus, through different lenses to do that. But we really want to see, your interest here in that.
What kind of time do you expect for those group meetings?
It'll be up to the group. But I think,
Do we have
in terms
time?
of having a full discussion, I think, right, you probably need somewhere in the range of at least 90 minutes to 2 hours, maybe 3, to like go through and just like have a deep, I think after that, right, people start to wear out, can't have it. And then we'll think about, right, the cadence, how many times do we need to meet to discuss this? And I think the time to do it is in between these advisory council meetings.
Is there an expected timeline that you want the special of these groups to? have
I think
complete?
working through the modules in terms of like when we want to get the modules drafted, we'll say, all right, if our goal is to get the draft module here, we need feedback from the working groups before that. So whether you want to like pound it out and meet, 2-3 times, right away, or spread it out, I think we'll
Okay.
work back to that.
I just was thinking about the working groups themselves, and sustainability is a very big topic because people will move into like open space and solar and urban agriculture and transportation and land use. And so like, that's like, there's a lot in that. And so I don't know how it's like a huge thing. So maybe it needs to be a little bit, it shouldn't be that broad. Because then people will be like, you shouldn't be developing in flood areas. Whatever. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
I
gonna-
think
it's
some of
gonna
those-
spiral.
Right.
Yeah, well, some of the resiliency components, maybe sustainability and resiliency are two separate things. And you put like community safety with resiliency and transportation with sustainability. And
We just might want to like,
I mean, there's always going to be overlap no matter how we divide it up.
there will be, it's just like, that one is such a.
Yeah.
So I don't know, that was just my one comment, I don't have a solution.
I agree, and I think maybe it would help if we broke down the topics that we anticipate should come to subgroups so that we're giving whoever takes charge of these some parameters so that we don't go off and get into things that don't necessarily apply or fall within the zoning ordinance. But I do think these are topics that cover a lot of subgroups, so maybe as you're thinking through the process, more direction on that.
Suggest trying to get like 4 or 5 total, just from a management perspective. Any more will be pretty untenable. Unless it is like a specific spot. We just need to have like 2 hours to talk about how places of worship are gonna think about this. That one.
I mean, some of them
kind
will say the group may be just like a round table or an open house, or we just go through and it's a one-time event.
Right. So.
We'll take a look at this list and kind of.
together if you have suggestions. This evening, I'll get back the survey. Again, I know some who comment on that they were willing to leave at this point. The staff will be here to support and help with the agenda. One of them goes. So please take a moment when you get the survey to take time to respond to it so that you won't be voluntold and put on a work group. Throwing that out there. 'Cause there's a lot to cover and a limited number of us. Just teasing, I won't do that. We'll make some. Back to Renee.
All right. Thank you, Marianne. So yeah, I think I guess this will unfold over the next little bit as we plan these groups. Just to reiterate, I think what Kevin said before, I think I'm hoping that these groups can be a way that we can augment the discussion sessions we have with the whole ZAC for each one of these modules, just given the limited time that we have. So hopefully it's a way we can get into more detail and get more expertise on specific topics. So I'm going to move on to the next topic now, which is the updated zoning districts. And I know we've got just a little over half an hour left. So what I'm going to show you now is revisions that we've made to the palette of zoning districts since we presented them last to you in, I guess, in November with some discussion in December. And so I'm going to go over some changes that we've made. It's a little bit different than what you had sent to you earlier after some discussions with staff. I think, as was said earlier, we made a few tweaks over the last little bit. So we'll make sure we get you the latest presentation soon. These are definitely not final. These are for discussion today and potentially later on. But I think the idea is that this is kind of a preview of what's going to be presented to the public in the open house in February, plus whatever additional tweaks we might make after this, between this and February. But I'm hoping that we can kind of give you an idea of what's going to be presented there, and we'll be presenting it in a similar level of detail. So it will be you won't get the full details until we get into Module 1 in March. So this is still just a kind of the more conceptual level. But here's kind of a summary of changes we made to the table before.
Renee,
And yeah.
can you reshare your screen?
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you able to see it now? I apologize. Yes. Okay. Great. So this is sort of the palette that was shared before, and this is a bit of an overview of the changes that were made. And on a lot of these points, we're open to changing again. We heard some comments, or I heard some comments before, but the duplexes, I guess we've got sort of competing views from different members of the ZAC or different ZAC meetings before, and that may be based on who attended different meetings. So happy to kind of continue that discussion going forwards. I think the consultant team could go either way on some of that, but I'll give you our rationale for the changes that were made in any case. So for the residential, first of all, I should just say for the general kind of scheme here, we have renamed some of the districts, and I'll show you the new names afterwards. Not to confuse you, I hope, but to be a little bit more intuitive. We heard that comment made in the last meeting that some of the ABC was getting a bit confusing. So I'm hoping we can make it a little bit easier to understand. So I'll show those new naming conventions with you after this. That doesn't change most of the districts, it's just a change of their name and abbreviation. For the residential districts, we've expanded the scope a bit for RA, which was the one that was about manufactured homes before, and I'll go over more what that means in a second, just to make that district a little bit more versatile. We've removed duplexes from RB and RC, which were the single family districts. And again, happy to have that discussion go on further. We just, I think the rationale was that we'd heard opposition to it from some members of the ZAC before, who felt like it was sort of going against or going kind of beyond the desires of Richmond 300. So we're just trying to keep within the kind of the intents of that plan, but happy to kind of keep having that discussion. We've added an additional smaller lot, single attached district that would follow after that. When we did a bit of an analysis, we found that the current ones that we were proposing didn't capture some of the smallest lots in certain neighborhoods. So we want to make those lots conforming if possible and allow people to do smaller scale developments. So I'll show you that in a moment. We've added 2 more districts. So At this point, we basically would have been going from a single unit district all the way up to one that would allow as many as 12 units of multifamily. That seemed like a really big jump. So we've added a 2-unit district that specifically allows up to 2 units in addition to those single attached districts. And then we've added a 6-unit district as well that would allow all the way from 1 to 6 units, so up to small apartment buildings. We've effectively merged what was called RDX and RX3. Those are the kind of the residential mixed use ones that allowed some other types of office or retail. They were just becoming very similar to each other, so it seemed like we could just put those together. We've removed RE, which you may remember was the kind of the deep front setback district. We asked about that. It seemed like the majority were against or felt like it could be removed, so we've taken that out for now. With residential mixed use, we've removed the restrictions on commercial size. Commercial still has to be only on the first floor, but we're not limiting the number of square feet anymore. For commercial mixed use, we've added one new more auto-oriented commercial district. We put that out to you before, just trying to be realistic about some of the outlying parts of the city where it didn't seem realistic to bring all the buildings up to the street. There may be a way we can do a better quality of more auto-oriented commercial development or commercial mixed use. We've removed a couple of the industrial mixed use districts. It just seemed like there was a lot of them. So we've taken a couple of them out and we've added a specific open space district for cemeteries because that wasn't captured before. So I'm going to go through this and I'm happy to kind of have discussion at the end if you don't mind. So this is the proposed new palette right now. A lot of it is the same, but I'll just go over the changes that were made. RC is what was previously the manufactured home district. We're calling that residential cottage now, and I'll show you why. For the residential single districts, we have them renamed as L, M, and H. So low intensity, medium, and high. And for the multi-unit districts, L, M, and H, again, low, medium, and high. Residential mixed use are the same. The ones that were previously called commercial mixed use, I've just called mixed use for now. It may have been a bit confusing to say commercial mixed use because they could really be a whole range of things. They could even be fully residential buildings. So these are kind of your primary mixed use districts. So we're simply calling them mixed use for now. For industrial, renaming those 2 districts to industrial light and industrial heavy, just to be clear about their intents. And for open space, for institutional, just calling that one district institutional rather than civic, which I think is what we had before. And for open space, just making those districts clear in terms of their names, parks, conservation, and cemeteries. So to go through, what the rationale was for some of those new districts that were being put in. For RC, this is just based on a discussion we had with staff, not with the ZAC, but happy to have that discussion with you now as a group, if you like. Just the thought that the manufactured homes that district could be made a little bit more versatile. Maybe could accommodate other types of very sort of small or affordable type of developments, tiny homes, things that are more like single unit cottage courts, even if they are conventional houses, but maybe very small houses on small lots. Just thinking different ways that could allow maybe a larger scope of affordable developments to take place. Those could be subdivided as in a kind of conventional development with separate ownerships, or they could be under a single ownership, more like a traditional manufactured home park. So this allows higher density, but it limits the unit size. So this is a little bit like what we were talking about way back when we talked about the kind of bonus that would allow for very small unit sizes. And again, we think it's going to increase the versatility of the district, allow some more options. We think it's going to exist probably more as a tool. So when we get into the mapping, it won't be mapped that widely, but it will be an opportunity for potential rezonings in the future if somebody would like to take advantage of this zoning district.
Just a comment on that one. I think that's a great addition. And has opportunity for great flexibility in different areas.
Renee, if this is Elizabeth, if we could pause here for a second.
Sure.
We're discussing the RC and RB and RC are the areas where we removed duplexes, and I know that was a concern. Maybe you or staff are going to get to this, but while we're on that area, if we want to bring that up, so I don't
Yeah, so I'm going to go through all the districts in a sec, and you'll see the same pages that we shared with you with pictures before. So happy to have that discussion just in just a second. RSH, so this is the sort of the higher intensity single family district. So this is in addition to the sort of the two other single family districts that we had before. Thinking about going down as small as a minimum lot size of 2,000 square feet and 20 feet width. Why for that? We took a look at some of the existing R5 zones, and we found that about 21% of the R5 zones, R5 zone lots are actually below 5,000 square feet today. Only 2% of them are below 2,000 square feet. So if we make that change, we can make a lot of those lots conforming, and we can allow the potential for smaller lots in this area. So we know that Richmond 300 says in the residential area 5,000 to 20,000 square feet, but it does say up to 5,000 to 20,000 square feet. So thinking about pushing this a little bit lower, but again, happy to have that discussion with you guys. Let me just go through the other ones here. This is just a distribution of lot sizes for Oak Grove. You can see how many fall below the R5 in terms of size. Now, we don't think this is going to necessarily stimulate a whole lot of new development. And so maybe to either assuage your concerns or to might disappoint you depending on what you want. But based on the analysis that we did before, the economic development analysis, we did find there probably would not be a whole lot of new development happening if we lowered lot sizes. But we do think it's just important to make some of those lots conforming and to give people the option to do that if they like in certain parts of the city. RML, so this is, again, I know these sort of new names are probably confusing, but this is residential multi-unit low intensity. So this is adding, since we've removed duplexes from the other two units at the moment, we're adding in a new zone that would allow duplexes specifically, or up to duplexes. So it would be up to a maximum of 2 units per lot, either attached or detached. It would fit between these two other, the most intensive single attached zone and the medium intensity multi-unit zone. The reason for that is that it just seems like there's a bit of a gap between these two at this point if we're removing duplexes from the single family. So this just creates a new opportunity in between there. It would largely replace, I would say, R6, R7, and R8 zones in places. So this would be applied in a lot of urban areas like Jackson Ward and the Fan. It would be a closer match for these districts than the previous zone that we were talking about that would allow up to 12 units. Now, we know there are multi-unit buildings in those areas right now, and so we would apply the other more intensive residential multi-unit zones to capture those, whether they're 6 units or 12 units. But it would allow just a bit of a tighter fit to what's there right now. And this one here, this is the 6 units. So again, sort of the same rationale, it's one more gradation. So we're going from 1 unit to 2 units to 6 units to 12 units. It just creates a little bit more nuance in there. And so let me just go through these and then let's talk about them as we're cycling through. So the very first one here, the residential cottage district here, and again, this is just, this name could change. But the intent here again is to allow for that greater range of uses in those what was previously the manufactured home district. Any comments or discussion about this right now, other than what was already raised?
None.
No, okay. Glad people are happy with that.
Yeah.
You see areas where these are located? Do you have any just thoughts about this?
Where it's located?
Yeah, would some of these be potentially R1 districts right now?
Well, so I think that the intent of this is, so it would definitely get applied to the existing manufactured home zone districts, of course. I think beyond that would mostly be a tool, like I said, for redevelopment. So I don't think we're going to take conventional neighborhoods and rezone them as for manufactured homes or tiny homes. It's going to be an opportunity that a developer might want to rezone to if they're acquiring a large lot in a residential area and they want to do a development like this.
I have a question building off of that, or at least something that maybe should be on the record as something to discuss later. At the risk of calling something spot zoning, which is like a faux pas in the zoning world, how small of a site I know you say 20,000 square feet, but if you're trying to have a cute little tiny home village on a site that's 10,000 square feet, you're basically saying you can't request this rezoning, special use permit. So if we're trying to implement them like the key way, maybe this just doesn't work at all. Maybe it's like you said, a tool that if it works, great, but if it doesn't, find something else to develop. That's fine, but it's something I think could come up later if we're trying to fit these into smaller infill lots as like a affordability tool.
Yeah, I think, that number is not magic, and we're happy to consider changes to that. I think the thought was that it would be a kind of a larger site to begin with, where you could create a kind of community. So it wouldn't be taking like a sort of single, suburban, lot and
Right.
dividing it up. Because that would sort of challenge the kind of the general intent of those, single family zoning. This would be some sort of, special, larger development site usually.
Gotcha.
Sorry.
So the next two ones here are ones that were basically previously existing, except for the removal of duplexes. So this is what we're calling residential single unit, low intensity and medium intensity. So one of them is 15,000 square feet minimum. The other one is 5,000 square feet minimum. They're largely replacing R1, R2, R3, and R4 today. So I mean, I'll just put this out to you guys right now. I know some of you disagree with the idea of removing duplexes from these. Although I will just remind you again that we are going to add a duplex district.
And they still have the ADUs.
They do still have the ADUs, yeah. And we haven't really determined exactly what the rules will be for ADUs. We might, there might be opportunities to tweak the, the maximum size of ADUs and so forth as well going down the road.
Yeah, I know it's a big discussion, and I know there were zoning advisory council members who were pointing out that they thought Richmond 300 was very clear. I think Philip Hart has said that a few times now, that duplexes should not be on residentially designated properties for Richmond 300 unless they were on a major street. I don't know if we have a plurality here to suggest like we all agree, like not even a majority, definitely not a plurality, to suggest that we all agree with that. And even if it's just about, political signaling, like should we think as a city it's appropriate to say only the denser areas should be asked to bear the burden of duplexes, while the R1, R2, R3s of the world, Windsor Farms, et cetera, it doesn't make sense to say, even if they're not going to, like, I understand that. And even if you could do an ADU and that's effectively the same thing, might be worth opening that back up for discussion more formally with us as a board. I know it's like kind of a bigger issue, and not one that I don't think we have a consensus on. And if we're trying to green light a draft district for the general public in 2 months, and we have a meeting next month, this might be the time to talk about it, regardless of what we think is the fun. And the last thing I'll say there, currently, the notion of saying, oh, you can do an ADU anywhere, that's actively being undermined by the fire department right now. And I'm very much involved with that conversation. I'm happy to be public about that. So you might actually be in a situation where you can't do an ADU everywhere, but maybe you can do a duplex instead. Get that same number of, so there's a lot underneath the surface there, and there's a lot to kind of hammer out.
Isn't that a configurational issue though?
No, it's a hydrant access issue. Yeah.
I'm talking about, what if it's in the house though? It's not an issue.
What's in the house?
It's only a problem if it's a freestanding ADU.
Who's to say what Tony Jones will say the next time he gets a building? But yeah.
But there really isn't any legal difference.
And let's, can we sidebar the fire hydrant conversation?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, I'm just getting worried, like we have 15 minutes left in this meeting and we're just now getting to what I think is like the meat of like what we've been presented here today. And, I'm kind of frustrated with what I'm looking at here in that, we currently have 5 districts. I mean, I'll preface this by saying it depends, all this depends on where the mapping is, right? But if we're kind of assuming that, we're talking about current comparable zoning R1, R2, and if we're assuming that places are zoned that now would then become RSL. We have R1 through 5 currently that allow single family only right? And now we're kind of smushing that down into 3 districts that allow single family only. And we have to get all the way up to RMM before we're allowing, or sorry, RML before we're allowing duplexes. And that's supposedly comparable to R6, 7, and 8, which are single family detached, attached, and duplex. Like that's what R6, 7, and 8 allow now. So like, what are we changing? What are we making better? The height limit of 3 stories. Part of the problem with the current zoning is that large swaths of the city that have R6, R7, and 8 zoning have all these non-conforming uses that are either taller than 3 stories and or more than 2 units. And we're not changing that at all. Unless we're really sort of mapping things differently than what's applied here.
Yeah,
So,
so just to clarify, we are definitely mapping things differently. So when we're talking about which zones are comparable, the idea is really just to sort of talk about which zones have standards that are comparable, not necessarily, we're not just going to press a button and change them on the map to whatever we're suggesting. So the mapping will reflect Richmond 300. So for example, within the residential part of Richmond 300, where major streets pass through those residential areas, it calls for multi-unit, permissions. So we will be, applying multi-unit zoning to those major streets within residential areas.
Well, and just to look at it, when I look at, like, my house is R5, and when I look at the RSH, I know that doesn't really apply to my neighborhood. Probably my neighborhood would be RSM, like just thinking about where I live. But I would be fine, actually, if that's what my neighborhood is. I think we should have duplexes in RSM. I'm on, like, north of Battery Park, where there's like all the sports squares that are on kind of like bigger lots. Maybe some of them could be duplexes. But they're not gonna be like minimum lot size of 10,000 square feet, probably, because it's not really the pattern of that neighborhood today. So, I mean, that's one place where I can already see like that, the way they.
We're treating this as an overall zoning opportunity for the whole city, whether people consider it.
I mean, I can tell you from my experience, when we first started working on Richmond 300, we had residential, low, medium, and high. And then we ended up making it be just all residential because there was so much like debate over like, oh, this is low and that's medium and blah, blah, blah. And we're like, just residential. And we determined that high should never be alone because we don't want like towers in the park. We want them to be like in an urban area. So we were like, that always has to be mixed use. Kind of pushed the conversation in many ways because it was so difficult to be like, you have to allow duplexes in the R1, R2 areas, like with the major firebrand issue. So I mean, like, I think we look to, to me, this is sort of like we want to make everything that council will pass. And so how do we skirt that line between like pushing the envelope and then making sure that it's something that we can pass? Go ahead, Kevin.
But I think just from staff perspective, something you talked about, right, is always looking at interpreting Richmond 300 and, right, having zoning follow that plan. And so in terms of, I think, a few things, that phrase, in terms of having single family units, that is really hard to get around because that's very explicit in the plan. With that, I think things that should be discussed, and if you want to say push the envelope, and I'll just say, like, I'll be very honest, like, I don't see, and I look at it from a building code perspective. So 1 unit or 2 units, it's both residential building code, maybe they're interchangeable. So I don't see any difference between the two. The zoning, but it is a tool legally that can be used to stipulate some of those things. So I think the discussions about within that minimum lot sizes, and in terms of, again, these are minimums, and setting the bar of like, this is your minimum lot size you have to have. And in many cases, they're higher, and I think our ones that are being proposed right now are all lower than what's standard right now. So in terms of like, right, what's the minimum size you need to have a lot? And so thinking about where you put those. I think a second piece is also, further conversation about accessory dwellings. Right now, they're limited to 1/3 of the space. That was a way, again, had the discussion. Accessory means de minimis of, so de minimis can mean, I don't know, 2,000 square foot house and a 1950 square foot ADU. So I mean, if just talking out loud here in terms of wanting to come to some type of balance on things. But I do think it is important to Renee's point of like, we're just looking kind of like at comparables. This does not mean like these zones are going to get mapped exactly like the zones that we have right now. So I think it's just important to think about that. But just from a staff perspective, I think that's the tension that we're looking at in terms of, wrestling with this area, but also understanding, I think back to David's point about, and why we're having the market analysis in here in terms of like, well, we could do this, but will the market respond to it and will nothing happen? Versus like making some changes here is actually what's holding us back from the market moving forward with providing the housing units that we need. But I just want to make sure that I think this is an important discussion, but also like in the scheme of things, like where are we holding back because of zoning, right? The demand for housing units to be built. So that's not, but just some staff perspective in terms of like our thoughts about, again, kind of the proposal that came back.
I appreciate the notes around like Richmond 300, what it calls for and how it may not have called for duplexes and the flexibility to like allow duplexes by right. In my mind, it feels like it starts to become a contradiction between like the letter and the spirit of it. If we want to be equity focused, there seems to be a tension there to me. Because if we're not allowing duplexes in these single family areas, it's basically saying to certain people that they can't live there and they'll probably never be able to. Not to say that all of these the would-be duplexes are going to be affordable or that all of the would-be duplexes are going to, be able to be accessible to everybody. But still, we're looking at these single family homes, 2,000, 3,000 square feet, whatever. And in that way, we are going to be concentrating a certain income level, certain tax brackets in a way that I feel, and I would argue, impacts how, on the other hand, poverty will also be concentrated in the city. So I think a question that I would raise to the council, to everyone is like, do we want our work here to begin to tell people where they can and can't live in a way that is clearly going to fall on economic lines in that way? Like, is this the future that we want to start to create for Richmond? And when I think of us coming together to be equity focused, to be progressive, I don't think this does it. And I would hope that the equity focus in Richmond 300 could outweigh what might have been put together by the group who we've already identified wasn't well represented amongst like the focused populations that we're now trying to double back and integrate into the conversation. So, it's not up to me, but I think that's a tension that we should find time to resolve.
So I think that we've got a lot to discuss just with this one residential zone. And we don't even have 10 minutes left in the meeting. And I think there's a lot of thoughts and opinions that need to get out on the table. Renee, I know you have many more slides to go through, but I think that we can spend the rest of this meeting and probably an entire next meeting just on this topic alone. So I'm kind of putting Mary Ann on the spot here. I know we're not meeting in February, but I don't want to end this meeting without continuing this discussion, because I feel like as we get further, we're gonna have more of these conversations that need to happen as we get through each of these zones. Is there an option for a meeting in February so that we don't get behind? I realize that there's public meetings.
Haven't officially advertised. Would replace the one.
Sorry, Marianne, I can't hear you. Can you come a bit
Sorry.
closer to the mic?
Apologize. The goal is to have this information shared at the public meeting. So a draft.
districts.
Of the draft districts and the draft pattern book shared at those public meetings in February. The intent was to have a public meeting on that Wednesday night that this is normally scheduled, and then another public meeting on that Thursday night as well. So, yes.
Can I make a suggestion? I mean, could we pose these questions, you know, to the public?
That's what I was gonna ask as a follow-up as Mary is walking
Yeah.
through this. It's a great point Maritza was, would it help some of our conversations if we could obviously have opinions on both sides? There's some of us that don't want to see the duplexes. There's some of us that do. We all know that, you know, we need to focus on equity and housing affordability, and that's a big part of the conversation. Maybe it would give us some direction to hear what the public says, but we also know that some of the most engaged public are not the ones that this is going to impact, unfortunately. I'm just trying to say that politely.
Yeah.
So I don't know that we'll be getting the most valuable information, but it might help for some discussion points.
Colin and Renee right now is drafting what's going to be shared at this meeting. I don't know, Colin, were you about to say something?
No, I think, I mean, I would just suggest, I think, sharing this with the general public and seeing what they have to say. But I would lean towards putting duplexes in there now.
And letting the
Because it's
public-
hard to add things in, you know, it's easier to take things out and seeing what the general public says.
Yeah, we started with them and then we kind of felt like we had direction from the ZAC to remove them. But I think again, that may be, you know, reflecting of different breakout groups and different people attending different meetings and things like that. So I'm fine to add them in and to leave that as a question for discussion during the open house, and we can continue to work on it.
I hate to shoehorn anything else into that, but it's something that I know Wayne has brought up a few times now, and I do tend to agree. The branding of having a specifically industrial mixed use name district that could have dimensionally just been one of the commercial mixed use. Like, do we really need that branding? Some communities feel like that branding, perspective might get future developers off on the wrong foot if they're scared of doing a grocery store in an industrial area. Would they have even had that thought if it instead called something else? I know it's kind of a hypothetical question, but it is something that we've brought up a few times, and maybe that's something to ask the public too. Do we need a
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the intent of that, the reason why it's separate is that there would be, you know, potentially a wider range of uses allowed. In terms of form, it might be very similar, but it basically is saying you could have some light industrial in this area. And so, you know, maybe it's not a separate district, maybe it's some sort of a kind of add-on. It's a, you know, flexible variant or something of the mixed use districts. It's also a possibility.
I can see it both ways, but there's something to toss in there.
Marianne, one thing we can also just do from, as we're kind of planning out our own targeted engagement, is actually design a couple of roundtables, like specifically around the open houses to target some of these particular questions for discussion. So again, it's just so that we also we know who's going to come to the open houses, we know who typically comes to the open houses, so making sure that we've got another pathway, just because these are some very big issues that do need to be addressed now. They can't wait like 2 months or 3 months. So we can also think about building in, you know, around that kind of window of the open houses. It may not be the same days, but maybe within like a week or two of each other. A series of conversations with some of our targeted stakeholders. And also support getting feedback on those same issues.
And for purposes of the community discussion, does anyone have any heartburn adding duplexes back in so that we can at least attempt to get some feedback from the community? Okay.
I support that as you would know by now, but I think that the nomenclature is a little, the fact that duplex is such a hang up, I think the nomenclature of having it be single unit versus multi-unit districts, and now we're going to go to the public and say, should we have duplexes in our single unit districts? I think that's kind of putting the thumb on the scale for people to say no, which is not the intent, but I think that I kind of like it better with just ABC. You know, it's a more kind of fluid A, B, C, D, E, F, G type of a thing, as opposed to kind of bifurcating the residential into these kind of two hard categories.
Yeah, I think if we're putting them back, we'll change the names. Yeah.
So do I get, I guess, maybe an indication, I think, right? It's like an author getting your, like, you know, terrible first draft out there. But I think, right, it's probably about time in terms of like being able to get some feedback on those things. I think to the point about maybe the nomenclature, just like putting some very generic letters back on
Yeah.
and getting some feedback in terms of like, well, what does this say to you, public, in terms of like what this is? I mean, I guess, is there anything at this point that you would say, no, we're not comfortable getting some feedback on?
I think it's been stated that it's better to get the information out there now than try to add it in too late in the game. So be bold. And I think we're right about nomenclature and how we're using our words and terms. But I think we put the bold out there and see what kind of reaction we can get. But I would ask that if we reconvene, that maybe, and I'm sorry, you guys can throw something at me later, but we may need to look at a longer meeting, but also reserve, at least 30, 45 minutes for residential discussion and mixed use. I don't think that we're going to get through all these districts in one meeting. This is a lot, and making a lot of comments, which is why I had that kind of open comment period. So we could talk about that for the March meeting. By then we will have public feedback, which I think will take up a good portion. And then we need to get into the weeds of these districts.
For the sake of continuity, I think when we first began, there was a list of organizations that we came up with to make sure that everybody was at the table. And so I'm sure we're using that list to engage the public, right?
Yes.
Okay.
A lot of using that list a lot to look at these roundtable discussions of these activations I was talking about previously. Help us.
Gotcha.
If, sorry, I know we're basically at time right now. I just want to know if I could I have one more minute just to cycle through the rest of it? It's mostly just to say that not much has changed since the last draft we shared with you.
Go ahead.
So just quickly to flip through these, and you can look at these at your leisure later on. This was the medium density one that we talked about, single unit, and the smaller lot version here. And then the 3 different multi-unit ones that we discussed. And then of the residential mixed use, these have essentially not changed, except that the minimum commercial or the maximum commercial area has been removed. And then for the mixed use, this is essentially the same as before in mix 3 and 5. This is the additional, more auto-oriented, flexible version of mixed use 3-story, which we've added in here. So that's a new one. This one is still the same as before. And these 2, industrial mixed use, are the same as before. Industrial, other than the naming, is the same. Institutional, other than the naming, the same. And then for parks and open spaces, we've just added that one additional cemetery zone so that we capture that. So that's all. Just wanted to go through those with you.
Thanks for bearing with us, Code Studio. We make you revert back to letters and work you've done before.
No, it's fine. Thank you. Thank you for your input.
Well, I'll get this presentation emailed out to you all. This month. Include in that email the thoughts that you all cared about. Come back to me.
And don't forget the survey to folks when you get that for the working groups. Okay, so as we kind of already touched on, the February advisory meeting is going to be canceled because we are going to have some public meetings, which would be listed on your agenda. February 12th from 9 to 12 at City Hall, and then also 4 to 7 at Huguenot Community Center, and then February 13th from 4 to 7 at the main library. So this body won't reconvene as a group again until March 12th here at 4 p.m. in the 5th floor conference room. So the open meetings that I mentioned will include a panel discussion on housing and zoning in the evening of February 11th, and the 3 open houses share the pattern book and draft zoning districts. I get all the right details. Okay. So the details, all these will be shared with you via email and posted online. With that, I'm going to adjourn since we're running a few minutes behind, and thank everyone for their time and feedback today.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Yeah. It's okay.